The courtroom felt unusually heavy that morning, as if the air itself understood something was about to break. A teenage girl stood before Judge Caprio, her hands shaking so visibly that even the people in the back rows leaned forward. She kept her eyes low, as though any glance upward might shatter her entirely. Judge Caprio watched her closely, adjusting his glasses with that familiar mix of patience and intuition. He had seen nervous defendants before, but this was different. Something inside her was fighting to stay hidden. He spoke gently, hoping to steady her, but before he could finish, she cut in with a trembling voice. Can I call my dad?" The room rippled with gasps. It was the kind of request that didn't just bend courtroom norms, it snapped them. Caprio paused, his expression tightening as he weighed the meaning behind her question. "Who is your father?" he finally asked. She swallowed hard. "He's the police chief." The words dropped like a stone into water. Even the court officers exchanged startled looks. Caprio leaned back, momentarily frozen, a rare flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. The girl reached for her phone with fragile determination, tapped the speaker icon, and held it out. A loud, echoing ring filled the courtroom, bouncing off the marble walls, amplifying everyone's heartbeat. Another ring, then another. People held their breath, waiting. Because no one in that room, not the judge, not the officers, not even the girl, expected who would answer that call, or what he would say next. The moment her father's title left her lips, the entire case transformed. A routine hearing became a collision between vulnerability and authority. A quiet teenager suddenly standing at the crossroads of power she never asked to hold. Involving a police chief wasn't simply unusual, it carried weight. Expectation and the kind of political tension that could tilt a courtroom off balance. Judges rarely spoke directly with law enforcement leaders during active cases, certainly not because a frightened child requested it. Yet here they were, suspended between protocol and an unfolding human story. Judge Caprio felt the shift. He was known nationwide for his compassion, for the gentle steadiness that made ordinary people feel seen. But compassion did not mean surrendering fairness, and fairness did not bow to rank. Still, he could sense the unease spreading through the room. Officers stiffening, spectators whispering, and the girl herself shrinking into her oversized hoodie as if wishing she could disappear. Her voice had carried her father's title, but her trembling hands betrayed something else entirely. Was she trying to use influence to soften her fate? Or was she calling for protection in the only way she knew how? The question echoed in every mind present, raising the tension with each unanswered ring from the phone. It wasn't just the legal system that now stood opposite her. Was her father's shadow, his authority pressing into the corners of the room. A police chief's involvement could so easily bend the line between justice and favoritism. Between a fair hearing and silent pressure, Caprio watched her carefully. Reading the conflict flickering behind her eyes, she wasn't arrogant nor defiant. If anything, she looked afraid of what awaited her on the other end of that call. And that fear stirred something in him, reminding him why he sat on that bench in the first place, to protect the integrity of justice. But also the dignity of those who came seeking it. The longer the phone rang, the more every second seemed to tighten around them. Everyone waited for the inevitable voice of authority to burst through the speaker and shift the balance entirely. But the real shock wasn't her reaching out to him. The real shock was what the chief would say when he finally picked up for years. The police chief had towered over the city's consciousness like a granite monument, kneeling, immovable and unmistakably dominant. His name carried weight in every neighborhood, every beat, every late-night patrol radio. To some, he was the iron backbone that kept chaos from swallowing the streets. To others, he was a reminder of how power, once concentrated, could grow sharp edges. His reputation for strictness wasn't merely professional, it was legendary. Officers joked that if discipline had a voice, it would sound exactly like his, clipped, commanding, and impossible to ignore. Around town, stories about him circulated like folklore. Some praised the moments he'd stepped into danger without hesitation, leading by example. Others whispered about the times he pushed his authority just a step farther than necessary, not enough to cross legal lines. but far enough to leave people questioning his judgment. A mother once recounted how he berated her teenage son for skateboarding near a courthouse ramp, not for the act itself, but for disrespecting state property. A business owner described how the chief had shut down their block for hours over an expired permit, lecturing the entire street as though they were unruly children. Small moments, individually defensible, but collectively revealing a man who believed deeply in the rules. He felt entitled to interpret as he pleased. Rules apply to everyone, he was known to say. But those who worked closest to him added the unspoken second half, except when he decides otherwise. It was that contradiction, his public devotion to order, and his private flexibility of IT, that shaped the complicated duality of his leadership. As a father, he was no softer. His daughter grew up under the shadow of expectations cast long before she learned to walk. Good grades weren't achievements. They were obligations. Mistakes weren't moments for guidance. They were affronts to the family's image. He loved her, undoubtedly, but his love often arrived wrapped in discipline, never vulnerability. Their home was one where silence carried more weight than conversation, where eye contact could feel like an interrogation, and where emotions were treated like trespassers to the outside world. He projected a polished, almost heroic persona, man who kept the city safe, who stood tall in uniform, who represented strength. But behind closed doors, he was a man terrified of appearing weak, even to his own child. She had learned to walk carefully, to speak cautiously, and to avoid disappointing him at all costs. That was why her trembling in the courtroom meant more than nerves. It was the fear of a daughter who knew the consequences of imperfection in a household ruled by authority. Everyone assumed the call she made was a plea for help, a reach for protection from the man who enforced the rules for an entire city. Surely her father would step in. Surely he would soften for her. But what he said on that call, what he revealed in those first few seconds, changed everything. The courtroom thought they knew about him. Long before he ever wore a judge's robe, Frank Caprio learned the weight of dignity from the narrow, working-class streets of Rhode Island. His parents, Italian immigrants, taught him that fairness wasn't an idea reserved for courts and officials. It was something you practiced at the dinner table, in the neighborhood, in every small decision no one else would ever see. His father laid bricks for a living, his hands rough from years of labor, yet he would stop and help strangers carry groceries simply because kindness cost nothing. His mother, soft-spoken but iron-willed, reminded him that people's mistakes were not their identities. Together, they shaped a child who saw humanity before judgment and compassion before punishment. Growing up, Caprio watched neighbors struggle with language barriers, poverty, and discrimination. He saw how easily the system ignored the people who needed it most. Those early memories carved empathy deep into him, not as a strategy, but as a reflex. Even as a teenager, he had a quiet way of listening, really listening to people around him. It became his defining trait long before it became his judicial signature, when he eventually stepped into the courtroom as a judge. He carried those lessons with him. He never rushed through a case, never dismissed a trembling voice, never allowed the weight of his position to overshadow the humanity standing before him. People described him as the only judge who made defendants forget they were in trouble, even if only for a moment. He asked questions not to trap but to understand. He offered grace when the law allowed it, firmness when it demanded it, and dignity always. But empathy didn't make him naive. Over decades on the bench, Caprio had seen the darker edges of power officials who tried to pull strings, officers who pushed their authority, and individuals who believed their titles elevated them above accountability. He despised that. Abuse of power was, to him, the most cowardly betrayal of public trust. And so each time authority tried to lean on him, he pushed back with quiet but unshakable resolve. There were cases that defined him. The young father fined for parking during a medical emergency, whom Caprio forgave with a gentle smile. The elderly woman living on disability whose trembling explanation made Caprio waive her penalty entirely. The immigrant mother terrified she'd be jailed over a simple ticket until he reassured her softly, "You're safe here." Oh, these moments didn't just show who he was, they reinforced who he refused to become. And there were moments few knew about private. Confrontations where he stood against political pressure, choosing integrity over convenience. He had declined calls from officials more than once, refusing to bend a ruling for connections or influence. Each refusal strengthened his belief that the courtroom must remain the one place where titles held no advantage. That was why this moment, this trembling teenager whispering that her father was the police chief's, struck him so profoundly. It wasn't merely an unusual request. It was the type of crossroads that separated judges who wore robes from judges who carried principles. The phone in her hand wasn't just a device. It was a lifeline that could easily be twisted into a lever of power. Caprio looked at her and saw more than fear. He saw a child caught between the authority of her father and the vulnerability of her own mistakes. He knew she wasn't trying to weaponize influence. She was trying to survive the expectations of a man who didn't understand softness. As the phone continued ringing on speaker, Judge Caprio felt the weight of his entire career settle on his shoulders. Everything his parents taught him, everything he had practiced over decades, every stand he had taken against corruption, all of it converged into this single, fragile moment, because everything he ever stood for was about to be tested. Live, on speakerphone. The courtroom felt colder the moment the clerk whispered, "Call is connecting, Your Honor." Every eye locked on the trembling teenage girl sitting at the defendant's table. She kept clutching her sleeves, as if bracing herself for something none of them could see. A faint click echoed through the speakers. "Hello, who is this?" The police chief's voice came through deep, stern, and unmistakably annoyed, the tone of a man who was used to giving orders, not receiving calls. Judge Caprio leaned forward, calm and respectful. "Chief, this is Judge Caprio from Municipal Court. I have your daughter here. We need a brief clarification." A beat of silence, then a slight shift in tone, arrogance creeping in like a slow fog. Judge Caprio. "Right, I assume this is a simple misunderstanding. My daughter has always been a good girl. Handle the matter gently, will you?" It wasn't a request. It was an instruction, a subtle attempt to exert authority over the courtroom. The judge's expression didn't change. "Chief, in my courtroom everyone is treated fairly. I simply need to understand the situation from both sides." On the other end, the chief exhaled sharply. "Of course. But let's not blow this out of proportion. Kids make mistakes. I'm sure you can use your discretion." Courtroom shifted. A few murmurs, a few raised eyebrows. The girl's face went pale. Her foot tapped uncontrollably under the table. Something about her father's tone didn't comfort her. It terrified her, Judge. Caprio noticed. He softened his voice toward her. "Is there anything you'd like to say before your father continues?" She shook her head quickly, almost fearfully. Eyes fixed on the floor, the tension rose like a slow-moving storm. On the phone, the chief continued talking, almost rambling now, sounding less like a concerned parent and more like a man trying to protect his image. "Just take care of it quietly, Judge. No need for any public fuss. You understand me?" The judge's jaw tightened. The courtroom went still. Even the stenographer stopped typing, and then the chief said something that made the entire room fall silent, something no one expected, something that would flip the power dynamic in an instant. For a heartbeat, the courtroom sat frozen. The police chief's last arrogant remark still echoed through the speakers. "Just make this go away. Judge, you know who I am?" A low ripple of disbelief moved through the audience. Some shook their heads. Others exchanged glances. The teenage girl flinched, not at the content, but at the familiarity of that tone. Judge Caprio didn't react immediately. He simply folded his hands. Breathing in slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle, he turned his gaze toward the girl. Her eyes were glossy, her breathing uneven. She wasn't just nervous, she was frightened. Not of the court, but of whoever was on the other side of the phone. That realization hit the judge harder than anything. The chief had said. He leaned slightly forward and spoke into the microphone, his voice gentle but unwavering. "Chief, before we proceed, I need to make one thing absolutely clear." A pause. A long, deliberate pause. Then the line he would become known for, the line that would blow up on social media, the line that would hit the chief like a sledgehammer wrapped in velvet. Sir, in this courtroom, everyone is equal. The room erupted in murmurs, soft exclamations. A gasp from the back row, even a subtle nod of approval from the bailiff. But the biggest reaction came from the girl. She looked up, actually. Looked at the judge for the first time, as if someone had finally stepped onto her side of the battlefield. On the speaker, the chief scoffed. Judge, I understand the theatrics, but I'm simply asking you to exercise common sense. This doesn't need to turn into a spectacle. Caprio's tone remained calm. He was ice on the surface, fire underneath. This is not a spectacle. Chief, this is your daughter's life. Another shift in the courtroom atmosphere. You could feel the tension thicken. The chief, trying to reassert control, replied, I know my daughter. I know what she does. She exaggerates when she gets emotional. Just tell me what she's saying over there. The girl's lip trembled. Judge Caprio saw the fear in her eyes. And something else. Pain. Long-term, deeply rooted pain. He spoke gently. She hasn't said anything yet. I'm giving her time. The chief let out a sharp, defensive breath. Time. For what? She knows better. She knows she can come to me. The judge tilted his head. Does she? That single question landed like a direct hit. The chief hesitated. Just for a second. But that second was enough. Judge Caprio pressed slightly deeper. Still calm, measured, surgical. Chief, did you know she had an issue at school this week? There was silence. The girl's eyes widened. She hadn't told the judge anything, not yet. She wondered how he could possibly know. He was testing, and the chief walked right into it. Yes, the chief admitted slowly. She mentioned something. The courtroom leaned in. Caprio continued. And did you talk to her about it? Ask her how she felt. What it meant to her? A long pause. Then the chief said the words that would destroy his public persona unintentionally, carelessly, as if they meant nothing. I didn't have time for all that. Kids need discipline, not coddling. The air was sucked out of the room. Gasps, headshakes. One woman covered her mouth. The girl broke. Her shoulders collapsed. Tears spilling out, she tried to hide. Judge Caprio's voice softened immediately. Take your time, dear. You're safe here. Her chin quivered as she whispered. I didn't call him to protect me. I was scared of what he'd do if he found out. The chief heard it. Everyone heard it. And for the first time since the call connected, the chief went silent. Not defensive. Not authoritative. Just silent. The judge took advantage of the moment. Tack. But to guide, he leaned closer to the microphone, speaking slowly, purposefully. Chief, your daughter didn't come here to embarrass you. She came here because she felt alone, because she felt she needed help, not punishment. No response, the judge continued. You asked me to use discretion. I am. But discretion does not mean favoritism. It means listening to the person who is hurting, even if that person is your own child. Read more. Silence. The courtroom watched the unraveling of a man who had spent his entire life in control now, realizing he'd failed in the one place control mattered most. His family. Judge. Caprio turned to the girl. What did you fear he would do? She swallowed hard. Get angry. Not at what I did, but at how it might make him look. The chief inhaled sharply. Whether in guilt or defensiveness, no one could tell. Judge Caprio then delivered the moral mic drop, the line that would echo across social media. The line that would define the episode, Chief. Power means nothing if the people closest to you are afraid of you. A child's respect is earned, not commanded. Quiet, absolute silence. Even the fluorescent lights above seemed to dim in respect. Caprio continued. Firm, but compassionate. You've spent your life enforcing rules, but the hardest rule you will ever face is listening to the truth from someone you love. Another beat. Then gently, today isn't about the law. It's about understanding the damage silence can cause inside a home. The chief exhaled, and for the first time there was no bravado, just a defeated, vulnerable man. The girl wiped her tears. The judge looked between them, summing up the moment with a final, steady line. And that's when everything shifted, not just in the courtroom, but for the chief himself. By the time the gavel finally hit, the courtroom had emptied. But the story had already begun to ripple far beyond its walls. Within minutes, someone in the gallery had uploaded a clip of the call, the moment Judge Caprio delivered his calm, devastating response, and it spread like wildfire. On TikTok, users recreated the scene with split screens and dramatic captions. On YouTube Shorts, the courtroom tension played out in 30-second bursts that drew millions of views. On Facebook, parents and teachers debated the significance of the exchange, sharing screenshots and commenting on the lessons learned. Hashtags lit up across platforms, hashtag Caprio Justice, hashtag Equal for All, hashtag Courtroom Moment, a collective echo of surprise, admiration, and outrage. Commentary followed immediately. Some applauded Judge Caprio for his unwavering fairness and the moral clarity with which he handled the delicate situation. Comments poured in, describing him as a model of justice, tempered with empathy. A judge who didn't merely enforce the law but safeguarded dignity. Others, however, criticized the chief's behavior. Some called it an abuse of authority, while others debated whether his parenting style was too strict, too self-interested, or simply misjudged. The tension of public discourse mirrored the tension of the courtroom. Highlighting the universal struggle between power and accountability, news outlets quickly picked up the story. Local channels ran segments analyzing the clip, dissecting the judge's words and the chief's reaction. National networks followed, framing it as a lesson in fairness, parenting, and the responsibilities of those in power. Legal analysts praised the judge's composure, noting that his ability to maintain authority while demonstrating compassion was extraordinary. Even social media influencers and community leaders shared the moment, emphasizing its broader implications. This wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was a cultural touchstone. The police department released a statement, carefully worded to acknowledge the events without overtly criticizing the chief. Yet the words themselves seemed to underscore a subtle shift in perception. Within the department, whispers circulated a rare admission that sometimes even authority figures can falter when personal and professional worlds collide. The girl, meanwhile, shared her perspective for the first time publicly. She described how the experience had changed her understanding of her father and of herself. For the first time, she felt heard, validated, and respected. The call had become a turning point in their relationship. Many parents, daughters, and young people related immediately, commenting on the courage it took to speak up and the delicate balance between love and authority. The conversation didn't stop at parenting. Social media debates and news segments transformed the incident into a broader discussion on power, fear, and accountability. It became a national conversation, a cultural mirror reflecting the struggles of authority, humility, and dignity. What began as a courtroom hearing had transcended into something far larger. This moment was no longer just about one girl, one judge, or one police chief. It had become a call-out of power, fear, parenting, and dignity, challenging every viewer to examine their own understanding of authority and respect. And in that way, it resonated far beyond the walls of the courthouse, inspiring debate, reflection, and ultimately, change. The courtroom had finally settled, but something deeper lingered, a quiet, collective understanding that everyone had just witnessed more than a legal exchange. Judge Caprio leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful, almost gentle, as he took a moment to look at the girl, then at the phone still resting on speaker. What he said next wasn't aimed at winning an argument, nor at putting a man in his place. It was meant to heal something broken, he began softly. Justice isn't just about rules. It's about understanding the people standing before us. His voice carried calm authority, the kind that didn't need volume to command the room. Compassion without fairness becomes favoritism, but fairness without compassion becomes cruelty. The words settled like warm weight, steadying the air around them. He glanced at the girl. "It took courage for you to speak today. More courage than many adults muster in a lifetime." Then he turned his attention to the phone, addressing the chief with a tone that was equal parts firm and fatherly. Influence doesn't make a situation easier. Sometimes it makes it harder, because power tempts us to protect ourselves instead of the people who need us most. The chief remained silent. But something in that silence felt changed, humbled, reflective. "Stripped of its earlier edge," Judge Caprio continued. "Children don't need authority swinging over their heads. They need to be heard. They need patience. They need someone who listens before they judge." He looked again at the girl, whose breathing had softened. "Respect comes from presence, not position. And reputation means nothing if the people at home are hurting." He let the room breathe, then delivered the message the episode would be remembered for, a final line that distilled the entire moment into a timeless truth. Dignity isn't given by rank. It's earned by character, as the dust settled from that unforgettable courtroom moment. It became clear why the story had captivated so many: a young girl, a police chief father, and Judge Caprio's unwavering commitment to fairness had collided in a way that no one could ignore. The title of this video, "She Called Her Police Chief Dad During Court. Judge Caprio Put Him on Speaker. Then This Happened," isn't just a description. It is a reflection of the timeless struggle between authority and empathy, power and dignity, fear and courage. What happened that day reminds us all of a crucial lesson. True justice is not measured by rank, influence, or reputation. It is measured by the courage to listen, the humility to step aside from power, and the willingness to treat every person, regardless of their station, with respect. Judge Caprio didn't just enforce the law. He reinforced a moral principle that resonates far beyond the courtroom walls. And the chief's response revealed the consequences of prioritizing authority over understanding, reminding us that real leadership is earned, not commanded. Take a moment to reflect on your own life, your relationships, your work, the ways you wield influence. Are you listening as much as you are speaking? Are you acting out of compassion as much as control? Stories like this challenge us to think deeper, act better, and uphold dignity in every interaction. If this story inspired you, subscribe to the channel. Share this video so more people can witness the power of fairness, the impact of courage, and the meaning of real justice. Together, we can celebrate empathy, accountability, and the strength it takes to do what is right, even when it's difficult.